He was gentle. She was magnetic. From the first moment, she felt as if he could see her soul. He read her silences like a language no one else had learned. And yet, as time went on, she began to disappear. Not suddenly, but slowly, like ink dissolving in water. Every part of her that once felt strong now existed only to reflect his brilliance. Jung would say she was never truly seeing him. She was seeing herself, the hidden half she had buried long ago. When Carl Jung spoke of love, he rarely meant affection or desire. He meant recognition, the soul recognizing what the conscious mind has forgotten. That is why attraction can feel like fate. Because in the other person we meet not who they are, but who we have refused to become. For the empath, this recognition is overwhelming. They sense the hidden wounds in others, as if those wounds were their own. They mistake that recognition for destiny, for a sign that they were meant to heal the other person. But Jung reminds us, what we try to heal in others is often the wound we have denied in ourselves. When the empath meets the narcissist, the chemistry feels ancient, as if they have known each other for lifetimes. In Jungian terms, it is not two people meeting, it is two shadows colliding. Each becomes a mirror for what the other has disowned. The empath, who represses anger and power, meets the narcissist, who hides fragility behind grandiosity. They do not fall in love, their shadows do. Jung wrote that what we reject within ourselves, we inevitably project onto others. In other words, the traits we cannot bear to own become the faces we are drawn to, or the ones we despise. For the empath, this process begins early. They learn that love is earned through understanding, not through power. They are praised for patience, for softness, for compassion, and quietly punished for anger, pride, or self-assertion. Over time, they divide themselves, one part that shines in the light of approval and one that sinks into shadow. That shadow does not disappear. It waits, and when the empath meets the narcissist, it finally finds a way to return. The narcissist embodies everything the empath has learned to suppress: confidence, certainty, dominance, self-importance. But beneath that surface, the narcissist hides their own rejected qualities: fear, fragility, shame, and dependence on validation. The two are not opposites, they are mirrors placed face to face, an infinite reflection of what each denies. To the empath, the narcissist appears powerful, someone who finally moves through the world without apology. To the narcissist, the empath appears pure, someone whose acceptance seems unconditional. Each sees in the other what they crave most, the missing half of their own psyche. This is the secret seduction of projection. It is not a search for love, it is a search for wholeness. We chase not the person in front of us, but the part of ourselves we abandoned. Jung called this the meeting of two unconscious systems, each attempting to complete the other, but doing so blindly. In this blind exchange, something sacred and dangerous happens. The empath's repressed power begins to live through the narcissist. They feel drawn to them, not because of love, but because, for the first time, their own buried strength has a voice, even if that voice speaks through someone else. The narcissist's repressed vulnerability begins to live through the empath. They are addicted to the safety they see in the empath's eyes, because those eyes reflect the gentleness they themselves destroyed. But projections are not stable. They are illusions wearing the face of another. Soon, the empath begins to notice the cruelty behind the charm, and the narcissist begins to despise the dependence they feel. The balance collapses. The mirror starts to crack. Every accusation becomes a confession in disguise. The narcissist says, "You're too emotional." But what he means is, "I cannot face my own pain." The empath says, "You're too selfish." But what she means is, "I cannot admit my need for power." In this endless reflection, both remain trapped in a psychological dance that Jung would describe as a confrontation of shadows, until one of them dares to stop the projection, to turn inward instead of outward. The cycle continues. Projection is seductive because it feels spiritual. "I've met my other half." But Jung would insist, what you have met is the part of your soul you exiled long ago. The narcissist is not your teacher. They are your reflection, distorted, amplified, and cruelly honest. And the moment you understand this, the spell begins to weaken. Love, when seen through the lens of the unconscious, is not always affection. It is compensation. Jung wrote that we do not fall in love. We fall into the image of what we lack. The empath believes they have found someone who needs them, someone fragile beneath the mask of pride. But this feeling of being needed is not love. It is a response to the part of the psyche that has been silenced. It is the child in the empath who once learned that love is earned through healing others. The narcissist, on the other hand, believes they have found someone who will finally worship them without limit. But that too is not love. It is the projection of the inner child who learned that love disappears the moment they appear weak. Two wounded systems meet, one addicted to saving, the other addicted to being saved. Jung would call this a psychological symbiosis. Each unconsciously feeds the other's illusion. The empath needs someone broken to feel whole. The narcissist needs someone whole to avoid feeling broken. For a time, this illusion feels transcendent. The empath sees themselves as the light in the other's darkness, unaware that this light is a form of control, an attempt to deny their own shadow by fixing it in someone else. The narcissist feels powerful, not because they are healed, but because the empath reflects an image of perfection they cannot sustain alone. And like all projections, this illusion must eventually collapse. The empath begins to sense a subtle decay, a dissonance between what they give and what returns. The more they offer compassion, the more the narcissist takes it as proof of superiority. Kindness becomes fuel for domination. Understanding becomes permission for cruelty. This is the paradox of the empath. They believe they are acting from love, but beneath that love lies fear. Fear of being unneeded, fear of their own anger, fear of becoming what they secretly despise. In Jung's terms, they are caught in the anima-animus inversion, projecting their inner opposite onto another in the hope of integration, without realizing that such integration cannot be borrowed. No one can complete a psyche from the outside. When love is born out of shadow, it does not heal. It repeats. It seeks the same pain over and over, as if by suffering enough, one might finally transcend it. But pain that is sought unconsciously only deepens the wound. Jung once observed that people do not have complexes. Complexes have people. In this relationship, love itself becomes the complex, a living thing that possesses both the empath and the narcissist, pulling them into a cycle that feels fated, but is in truth mechanical, the repetition of an ancient inner division. What the empath calls devotion is often avoidance, a refusal to look inward. It feels easier to heal another than to confront the places within where love has turned into dependence. In helping, they remain needed. In being needed, they avoid abandonment. And in avoiding abandonment, they avoid transformation. The narcissist senses this weakness instinctively, not through malice but through a kind of psychic radar. They see that the empath cannot leave because leaving would mean facing themselves, and so the illusion persists, not as romance but as an unconscious contract. You will carry my weakness and I will carry your shadow. This is not love. It is mutual blindness, wrapped in tenderness and tragedy. And yet Jung would not call it evil. He would call it necessary. Because only through such collisions do we begin to see what we truly are. The purpose of this relationship was never happiness. It was revelation. When the illusion of love finally breaks, the empath often believes the story has ended. In truth, it has just begun. Jung wrote that the shadow is not a monster to destroy, but a teacher to listen to. Every time the empath feels betrayed, unseen, or used, the shadow is whispering. Not about the other person, but about the parts of the self that have remained unclaimed. At first, this is difficult to accept. The ego, wounded and proud, wants to point outward. It was their fault, it says. They took advantage of me. And perhaps that is true. But Jung would ask, why were you there to be taken? The moment that question is asked, consciousness begins. The empath starts to see the pattern, not as fate, but as repetition. Each narcissist, each emotional storm was a mirror carrying the same message. You are not as powerless as you pretend to be. The shadow the empath has long rejected is not cruelty or malice. It is assertion, will, the right to exist without justification. The traits they condemned in others were, in fact, their own undeveloped strengths. By denying their own aggression, they became passive. By denying their own pride, they became servants. By denying their own need for control, they handed that control to others. The shadow was never the enemy. It was the energy that could have made them whole. Jung warned that when a person tries to be only good, they soon become nothing at all. Goodness without strength collapses into sentimentality. Compassion without boundaries becomes self-erasure. To integrate the shadow is to recognize that love without power is not virtue, it is fear wearing a halo. The empath begins to feel anger, and for the first time they do not rush to suppress it. They begin to say no, and for the first time they do not feel guilty. They begin to take space, and for the first time they realize that taking space is not the same as taking from others. This is the beginning of individuation, the process through which a fragmented psyche becomes whole. It does not happen through understanding, but through embodiment, through actions that contradict the old identity, speaking when silence feels safer, resting when guilt says, keep giving, leaving when love has become self-annihilation. Every small act of boundary becomes a ceremony of self-return. The narcissist, meanwhile, senses this shift. Their mirror is no longer compliant, their reflection no longer worships. The dynamic collapses, not through confrontation but through withdrawal of projection. The empath no longer feeds the illusion. They no longer need to be the healer, the saint, the savior. In Jung's language, the projection has been withdrawn. What was once seen out there is now owned in here, and this ownership is not pride, it is peace. The peace that comes from realizing that you were never missing a half, only missing yourself. When the empath learns to contain their own power, they stop seeking it in those who misuse it. When they accept their own darkness, they no longer need to be blinded by another's light. That is the paradox of shadow work. The closer you come to your darkness, the less dark the world appears. Because now the empath sees the narcissist not as a villain, but as a message. A messenger who spoke in cruelty what the unconscious could not yet say in words. And when that message is finally understood, it no longer needs to be repeated. When the empath finally stops running from the shadow, something subtle happens. The story of us begins to dissolve into the story of I. There is no sudden enlightenment, no triumphant awakening, only an ordinary stillness. The silence that follows when the need to understand has exhausted itself. The empath looks back at the pattern that once felt like fate and sees its architecture clearly. Every heartbreak, every betrayal, every loss, all carried the same message, spoken in different tongues. You cannot save what you still identify with. For years, they mistook pain for purpose. They believed that love without limits was the highest virtue. Now they see that the most sacred act of love is not to merge, but to differentiate, to allow the other to remain other, and to remain oneself. This realization does not erase compassion, it purifies it. It turns pity into respect, dependency into clarity, and attachment into freedom. The empath no longer sees their gentleness as weakness, nor their boundaries as cruelty. They understand that wholeness is not achieved by rejecting darkness, but by giving it a place to live. Jung called this process enantiodromia, the reversal of extremes. What begins as devotion turns into detachment. What begins as suffering becomes insight. The psyche, like a pendulum, swings until it finds equilibrium. The narcissist, once the mirror of the empath's unconscious, now fades into distance. They have served their purpose. They were never a soulmate, never a curse, only a reflection used by the psyche to reveal itself. The moment the projection is withdrawn, the connection loses its grip. The magnetism dissolves, not in anger, but in understanding. The empath does not hate the narcissist. They simply no longer need them. And in that lack of need lies the quiet birth of selfhood. This is not the end of shadow work. It is the beginning of maturity. A maturity that knows love can still be soft but not self-erasing. That compassion can coexist with boundaries, that silence can be strength, and strength can be kind. The empath now walks differently. They do not reach for every broken wing. They do not explain themselves to those committed to misunderstanding. They no longer confuse peace with passivity. They have learned that the true purpose of the shadow is not to be conquered, but to remind us that even in darkness, consciousness persists. Every human being must, at some point, walk through this mirror, the place where what you condemn in others meets what you have refused to see in yourself. For the empath, that journey was never about the narcissist. It was about learning to love without losing the self. When that lesson is complete, the need for repetition ends. The pattern dissolves like a dream after waking, and what remains is not bitterness, but stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing that you have touched the depths of your own nature and found there not a monster, but a mirror asking only to be seen. Carl Jung once wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That sentence, simple and vast, holds the entire journey of the empath. For a long time, they believed that healing meant escaping the darkness, escaping the toxic, the cruel, the manipulative. But true healing, Jung would say, begins only when you stop escaping, when you allow the darkness to speak its language, and you listen without fear. The narcissist, once a symbol of suffering, becomes a mirror that no longer wounds. Their face still exists, their behavior may remain the same, but in the empath, something fundamental has shifted. They no longer resonate with that frequency of need. The hook has lost its bait. This is the quiet redemption of awareness. Nothing outside you needs to change for your world to transform. You withdraw the projection, and the outer world rearranges itself accordingly. Not because reality has changed, but because perception has ceased to divide it into light and dark, good and evil, victim and villain. The empath finally understands that the shadow is not a curse, it is a compass. It points not toward fear, but toward the part of the soul that longs to be whole. Every wound was a doorway, every heartbreak was an initiation. Each time they broke, it was the psyche attempting to show them the shape of their own wholeness. And now, in the quiet after the storm, they realized that nothing was wasted. Even the pain had a purpose, to break the illusion that love is found in another, to show that the greatest act of compassion is to remain present with yourself. Jung called this reconciliation the union of opposites, the moment when the conscious and the unconscious, the light and the shadow, recognize each other not as enemies, but as collaborators in the same creation. The empath no longer needs to divide the world into those who hurt and those who heal. They have seen that every soul carries both capacities, and that wisdom lies not in choosing one, but in holding them together. There is a particular kind of peace that comes with this understanding. It is not the peace of perfection, but the peace of acceptance. The calm that follows when nothing inside you needs to be exiled anymore. And so the circle closes where it began, not with love lost or love found, but with the realization that love was never out there. It was the awareness that looked, the witness that endured, the silent part of you that watched every collapse and every rebirth and remained whole throughout. The journey through the shadow is not a descent into darkness, it is a return to reality. And in that return, the empath ceases to be a title or an identity. They become simply human, neither savior nor victim, but a consciousness capable of seeing both light and shadow without the need to escape either. That is where the work of the shadow ends, and the work of life truly begins.